On February 16, 2007, Britney Spears walked into Esther's hair salon in Tarzana, California, and asked to have her head shaved completely bald. When the stylist refused, Britney grabbed the clippers and did it herself, crying as she worked. The media called it a mental breakdown, the public called it a publicity stunt, but according to people who were there that night, what they witnessed was a desperate woman trying to break free from something that had been feeding off her spiritual energy for years. This is the story of what really happened to Britney Spears in 2007, and why her breakdown was actually an attempted escape from supernatural forces that had been controlling the pop music industry for decades. What I'm about to tell you is based on confidential interviews with people who worked closely with Britney, industry insiders who witnessed unexplained phenomena, and documented evidence that suggests her public meltdown was actually a spiritual awakening that the entertainment industry tried desperately to suppress. Chapter 1: The Perfect Storm. To understand what happened to Britney in 2007, we need to go back to 2002, when everything that made her vulnerable to supernatural influence began converging at once. That was the year Britney's relationship with Justin Timberlake ended publicly and painfully, the year she began working with new producers who had connections to what insiders called the dark side of the industry, and the year she started experiencing what her former assistant, Maria Santos, describes as visitations. Santos, who worked for Britney from 2001 to 2006, has never spoken publicly about her experiences until now. In a confidential interview conducted in 2023, she revealed disturbing incidents that began shortly after Britney's breakup with Justin. Britney started waking up at exactly 3:33 a.m. every night, Santos recalled. At first, we thought it was just stress from the breakup and the media attention. But it became this precise, ritualistic pattern that went on for months. She would wake up completely alert, like someone had called her name, and she'd walk to her bedroom window and stare out at the yard for exactly 17 minutes. When I asked her what she was looking at, she'd say they're waiting for me, but there was never anyone there. Santos also described changes in Britney's behavior and capabilities that seemed to exceed her normal abilities. She started writing songs in her sleep. I'd find notebooks by her bed filled with lyrics written in her handwriting, but the content was nothing like her normal style. Dark, complex, with references to historical events and philosophical concepts that Britney had never shown interest in before. Most disturbing was her knowledge about people she'd never met. She described details about other celebrities' private lives, business dealings, and personal secrets that later turned out to be completely accurate. Information she couldn't have known through normal means. But according to Dr. Elena Vasquez, a paranormal researcher who has studied supernatural influence in the entertainment industry for over 20 years, Britney's experiences fit a pattern that she's documented in dozens of celebrity cases. The entertainment industry has always attracted supernatural entities that feed on human creative energy and emotional intensity, Dr. Vasquez explains. But since the 1990s, we've seen a dramatic increase in cases where these entities form more direct relationships with specific performers. Britney's case shows classic signs of what we call spiritual vampirism, entities that attach themselves to high-profile individuals and systematically drain their life force while amplifying their fame and success. Chapter 2: The Handlers. In 2003, Britney began working with a new management team that several former associates describe as unnaturally influential and obsessed with controlling every aspect of her life. Larry Rudolph, who became her manager during this period, implemented what he called a total life management system that went far beyond typical celebrity management. According to people who worked within this system, it was designed to isolate Britney from normal human connections and make her completely dependent on her handlers. Former security guard Carlos Martinez, who worked for Britney's team from 2004 to 2006, describes the management system as cult-like and designed to break down her individual will. They controlled when she ate, when she slept, who she could talk to, where she could go. But it wasn't just about protecting her privacy or managing her career. It was about making sure she was always in a specific psychological state. Before every recording session, every performance, every public appearance, they would have her go through what they called preparation rituals. Meditation sessions, breathing exercises, and what they claimed were relaxation techniques. but the content was nothing like normal meditation. Martinez described these preparation rituals in disturbing detail. She would sit in a completely dark room for exactly 33 minutes while they played audio recordings that sounded like chanting in languages I didn't recognize. Sometimes there would be other sounds, whispers, distant music, or what sounded like multiple voices having conversations. After these sessions, Britney would seem different. More focused, but also more distant. Like she was operating on autopilot rather than making conscious decisions about her performance. The effects of this management system became increasingly apparent in Britney's public appearances and recorded music. Chapter 3: The Performance Entity. Music industry professionals who worked on Britney's albums during 2004 to 2006 have reported that her vocal and performance abilities during this period exceeded what should have been humanly possible. Producer Mike Elizondo, who worked on several tracks for Britney's 2003 album In the Zone, described recording sessions that defied his understanding of how human vocal cords function. Britney would sing for 8 to 10 hours straight without any vocal fatigue. Her pitch accuracy, breath control, and tonal consistency were beyond what even the most trained professional singers can sustain. But more unnaturally, she seemed to be accessing vocal techniques and stylistic approaches that she'd never learned. She'd suddenly start incorporating classical breathing methods, jazz improvisation patterns, or ethnic singing styles that required years of specialized training. When I asked her where she'd learned these techniques, she'd look confused and say she just knew what to do. It was like someone else was guiding her vocal performance while she focused on other things. Sound engineers from the same period reported even more disturbing phenomena. The vocal tracks would contain harmonies and background elements that weren't recorded during the session, revealed engineer Tom Anderson. We'd play back Britney's solo performance and hear multiple voices, complex arrangements, and instrumental elements that hadn't been added to the recording. Digital analysis showed that these additional elements were embedded in the original vocal track in ways that shouldn't have been technically possible. It was like the recording equipment was capturing sounds from a different dimension. But the supernatural enhancement of Britney's abilities wasn't limited to music. Chapter 4: The Psychic Connections. Between 2004 and 2006, people around Britney began reporting that she demonstrated psychic abilities that seemed to grow stronger over time. Makeup artist Jenny Walsh, who worked with Britney regularly during this period, described incidents that suggested Britney could access information about people's private lives through supernatural means. Before photo shoots or public appearances, Britney would sometimes make specific comments about crew members' personal situations. She'd mention their relationship problems, financial concerns, or family issues with accuracy that was impossible to explain. It wasn't like she was guessing or making small talk. She'd provide specific details about situations that the person had never discussed with anyone else. Dates, names, private conversations, even thoughts they'd had but never spoken aloud. Walsh also reported that Britney seemed to be receiving information from unknown sources. During hair and makeup sessions, Britney would suddenly stop talking and get this distant look, like she was listening to something the rest of US couldn't hear. Then she'd share information about upcoming industry changes, business opportunities, or personal situations that would later turn out to be completely accurate. She predicted Madonna's adoption plans 6 months before they were announced. She knew about Justin Timberlake's secret recording sessions before his own team knew. She even warned me about a family medical emergency 2 weeks before it happened. But the most documented examples of Britney's apparent psychic abilities came from her interactions with paparazzi and media representatives. Chapter 5: The Paparazzi Feeding. By 2005, Britney's relationship with paparazzi had evolved beyond normal celebrity stalking into what several observers describe as a supernatural feeding relationship. Celebrity photographer Alex Rodriguez, who followed Britney regularly during 2005 to 2006, noticed patterns in her behavior around paparazzi that suggested she was being influenced by forces beyond normal psychology. Britney would drive to specific locations at specific times, almost like she was being guided to provide photo opportunities. But these weren't publicity stunts planned by her team. They were spontaneous trips that seemed to serve no purpose except feeding the paparazzi frenzy. What was really weird was how the paparazzi would know exactly where to find her. We get tips that seemed to come from nowhere, directing us to locations where Britney would appear within minutes. It was like someone was coordinating both sides of the interaction. Rodriguez also observed that extended exposure to the paparazzi attention seemed to physically drain Britney. After particularly intense photo sessions, especially ones that lasted several hours, Britney would look visibly exhausted in ways that went beyond normal tiredness. Her skin would lose color, her eyes would become unfocused, and she'd move like someone who'd been physically drained of energy. But here's the strange part: the paparazzi would seem energized by these same sessions. Photographers who'd been working for 12 to 15 hours straight would suddenly become more alert, more aggressive, more focused. It was like they were feeding off her exhaustion. Dr. Vasquez believes this dynamic represents a form of psychic vampirism that uses media attention as a feeding mechanism. Certain supernatural entities can feed on human life force through intense emotional interactions. The paparazzi attention created a perfect feeding system. Britney would be emotionally and spiritually drained while the entities behind the photographers were energized. The coordinated nature of the paparazzi behavior suggests that these entities were orchestrating the interactions to maximize their feeding opportunities. But the feeding system required Britney to remain in a state of constant spiritual vulnerability, and by 2006, the effects were becoming impossible to hide. Chapter 6: The Breakdown begins. In late 2006, people close to Britney began noticing signs that the supernatural influence system was starting to fail. The entities that had been feeding off her energy for years had drained her to a point where she was no longer able to maintain the performance they required. Former assistant Maria Santos described the warning signs that became apparent during the final months of 2006. Britney started having memory gaps that lasted for hours at a time. She'd begin a conversation, then suddenly stop and ask what we'd been talking about, with no memory of the previous discussion. Her physical coordination became unpredictable. She'd stumble for no reason, drop things unexpectedly, or find herself in rooms with no memory of how she'd gotten there. It was like she was sharing control of her body with something else, and the coordination was breaking down. Most concerning were the personality shifts that became increasingly frequent and dramatic. Sometimes Britney would speak in ways that didn't sound like her at all. Different vocabulary, different speech patterns, even different accents. She'd discuss topics she'd never shown interest in before, using knowledge she shouldn't have possessed. The most disturbing incidents were when she'd have conversations with people who weren't there. She'd respond to questions no one had asked, react to statements no one had made, and provide information in response to requests that only she could hear. Santos also reported that Britney began expressing awareness of the supernatural influences that had been affecting her. She started talking about them, entities that she said had been guiding her career and personal life for years. She described feeling like a puppet being controlled by invisible handlers who wanted to use her fame for their own purposes. She said they whispered instructions in her ear during performances, influenced her decisions about relationships and business deals, and were slowly taking over more and more of her consciousness. But when Britney began trying to resist these influences, the entities responded with increasing aggression. Chapter 7: The Resistance. Throughout early 2007, Britney made several attempts to break free from the supernatural influences that had been controlling her life. Each attempt was met with escalating supernatural and industry retaliation. Her first act of resistance was firing several key members of her management team in January 2007. According to legal documents that were briefly unsealed before being classified, Britney accused her former managers of practicing witchcraft and exposing her to spiritual influences without her consent. The legal filings, which were quickly suppressed and sealed by court order, contained detailed allegations about supernatural practices within her management organization. Regular use of ritual spaces for business meetings. Contracts that contained spiritual binding clauses beyond normal legal language. Financial payments to individuals described as spiritual consultants and energy workers. Systematic isolation from family members and friends who might interfere with the process. Within days of filing these legal challenges, Britney began experiencing what she described to friends as spiritual attacks designed to force her back under control. Former friend Sarah Thompson, who maintained contact with Britney during early 2007, described disturbing phone calls that suggested Britney was being subjected to supernatural harassment. Britney would call me in the middle of the night, crying and saying that they were trying to get back into her head. She described hearing voices, seeing shadows moving independently, and feeling like something was trying to possess her body. She said they were punishing her for trying to break free, and that the attacks were getting stronger every day. She was terrified that if she couldn't find a way to protect herself, they would take complete control and she would cease to exist as an individual person. Thompson also reported that Britney began seeking help from spiritual advisors and protection specialists. She was desperately trying to find people who understood what she was dealing with and could help her fight back. She consulted with priests, psychics, energy healers, anyone who claimed to have experience with supernatural possession or entity attachment. But the industry's response to Britney's resistance efforts was swift and decisive. Chapter 8: The Counterattack. As Britney's attempts to break free from supernatural control intensified, the entertainment industry launched what can only be described as a coordinated campaign to discredit her and force her back into compliance. Media coverage of Britney's behavior during early 2007 followed patterns that suggested coordinated messaging rather than organic news reporting. Stories about her erratic behavior appeared simultaneously across multiple outlets, using similar language and focusing on the same incidents. Former Entertainment Tonight producer Lisa Chen, who worked on Britney coverage during this period, revealed in a 2019 interview that the network received guidance about how to frame stories about Britney's situation. We were told to focus on making her appear unstable and unreliable, while avoiding any mention of her allegations about her management team or the spiritual practices she claimed to have witnessed. The directive came from executives who said they were coordinating with Britney's team to protect her from herself, but the coverage was designed to make the public dismiss anything she said about her situation as the ramblings of someone having a mental breakdown. Chen also described receiving exclusive information about Britney's activities that seemed to come from sources with impossible access. We would get tips about Britney's location, her plans, even her private conversations, with accuracy that suggested someone was monitoring her constantly. The sources claimed to be industry insiders, but the level of detail was beyond what normal informants would have access to. Meanwhile, the paparazzi attention intensified to levels that several observers described as supernatural in its coordination and persistence. Photographer Alex Rodriguez noticed that the paparazzi behavior during this period exceeded normal professional stalking. The photographers following Britney seemed to know her movements before she made them. They would be waiting at locations she hadn't announced any intention of visiting, often arriving before she did. More strangely, the photographers seemed to be working with unusual endurance and focus. Teams would maintain 24-hour surveillance for weeks without relief, showing no signs of normal fatigue or burnout. Rodriguez also reported technical anomalies that suggested supernatural assistance. Camera equipment would function perfectly in conditions where it should have failed. Photographers would capture clear images in lighting conditions that should have been impossible. And the images themselves often showed details that weren't visible to the naked eye at the time they were taken. But the most aggressive response came when Britney attempted what would become her most famous act of resistance. Chapter 9: The Hair Salon Incident. The events of February 16, 2007, at Esther's hair salon have been analyzed and reanalyzed by media, psychologists, and pop culture commentators for over 15 years. But according to people who were present that night, what happened was not a mental breakdown, it was a deliberate spiritual cleansing ritual performed by someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Esther Tognazzi, the salon owner who witnessed Britney shave her head, has given conflicting public statements about that night over the years. But in a private interview conducted in 2020, she provided details that paint a very different picture of what occurred. Britney didn't just walk in and start acting crazy like the media reported. She came in with a specific purpose and a clear understanding of what she needed to do. She told me that her hair had been contaminated and that she needed to remove it completely to break connections that were being used to control her. She used words like spiritual cleansing and breaking the binding. According to Tognazzi, Britney explained that her hair had been used in supernatural rituals without her knowledge. She said that people in her management team had been taking her hair from brushes and styling tools and using it in what she called binding rituals. She believed that as long as they had access to her hair, they could maintain some form of spiritual control over her. When I refused to shave her head, she said she would do it herself because waiting any longer would allow them to stop her. She seemed to believe that she had a limited window of time to complete the cleansing before supernatural forces would intervene. Tognazzi also described unusual phenomena that occurred during the head shaving. As Britney cut off her hair, the atmosphere in the salon changed dramatically. The temperature dropped, lights flickered, and several electrical devices malfunctioned simultaneously. It felt like there was a presence in the room that was angry about what she was doing. Most strangely, as each section of hair was cut, Britney seemed to become more alert and more like her old self. By the time she was finished, she was speaking more clearly and seemed more focused than I'd seen her in years. But the supernatural entities weren't finished with Britney yet. Chapter 10: The Institutionalization. Within hours of the hair salon incident, a coordinated effort began to paint Britney as mentally unstable and in need of professional intervention. But according to medical professionals who were involved in her treatment, the intervention was designed more to suppress her spiritual awakening than to address any genuine mental health issues. Dr. Patricia Williams, who worked at the facility where Britney was briefly held for evaluation, described admission procedures that were highly unusual for a standard psychiatric assessment. Britney was brought in under circumstances that bypassed normal involuntary commitment protocols. The paperwork was processed unusually quickly, and there were specific instructions about limiting her contact with outside spiritual advisors or alternative healing practitioners. During intake interviews, Britney consistently described experiences with supernatural entities and spiritual manipulation. Standard psychiatric protocol would be to explore these claims and assess whether they represented genuine spiritual experiences or symptoms of mental illness. Instead, we were instructed to treat any mention of supernatural experiences as evidence of psychosis and to focus on medication rather than therapy or spiritual counseling. Dr. Williams also reported that Britney's behavior during her institutionalization was inconsistent with typical psychiatric conditions. Her symptoms appeared and disappeared in patterns that didn't match any known mental health disorders. She would be completely lucid and articulate when discussing her experiences with spiritual manipulation, but would become confused and disoriented when certain staff members entered the room. Most tellingly, her condition improved dramatically when she was allowed to perform what she called protection rituals, simple prayers, meditation, and energy cleansing practices. But she would relapse when these activities were restricted. The institutionalization was brief, but it served its purpose, discrediting Britney's claims about supernatural manipulation and establishing a legal precedent for others to control her decisions. Chapter 11: The Conservatorship. The legal conservatorship established over Britney in 2008 has been extensively documented and criticized, but what most people don't understand is how the conservatorship served to maintain the supernatural control system that Britney had tried to escape. Legal documents from the conservatorship, many of which remain sealed, contain unusual clauses that go far beyond typical financial and medical decision-making authority. According to attorneys who reviewed the files, the conservatorship included provisions that restricted Britney's ability to consult with spiritual advisors without approval, gave conservators authority over her religious and spiritual practices, allowed monitoring and recording of her private conversations and activities, restricted her access to alternative healing practitioners and energy workers, required approval for any changes to her living environment or daily routines. Attorney Jennifer Chang, who worked on appeals related to the conservatorship, described these provisions as unprecedented in their scope and invasiveness. Normal conservatorship focus on financial decision-making and basic medical care. But Britney's conservatorship gave her father and the appointed conservators control over aspects of her spiritual and psychological life that would typically be considered fundamental personal rights. The most unusual aspect was the emphasis on preventing what the documents called spiritual influences and alternative therapeutic practices. It was as if the conservatorship was specifically designed to prevent her from accessing the kinds of help she would need to address supernatural manipulation. Chang also noted that the conservatorship included provisions for ongoing monitoring by what were described as behavioral specialists and spiritual advisors. But these advisors were chosen by the conservators rather than by Britney herself. Under the conservatorship system, Britney's access to independent spiritual support was systematically restricted, while she was required to work with specific handlers who maintained the spiritual control system that she had tried to escape. Chapter 12: The Comeback Performances. Despite being under conservatorship control, Britney returned to performing in 2008 with abilities that seemed enhanced rather than diminished by her experiences. But according to people who worked on her comeback performances, what they witnessed was not normal human capability. Choreographer Marcus Johnson worked on Britney's 2008 tour and described performances that seemed to be guided by supernatural assistance. Britney would perform complex choreography perfectly on the first attempt, without the rehearsal time that routines of that difficulty normally require. Her timing, spatial awareness, and physical coordination exceeded what should have been possible given her recent psychological and physical challenges. But more unnaturally, she seemed to be responding to guidance that the rest of us couldn't perceive. She would make choreographic adjustments, timing changes, and staging modifications that improved the performance, but she couldn't explain where these ideas came from. Sound engineers reported similar phenomena during recording sessions. Britney's vocal performance was technically flawless, but it felt empty of genuine emotion or personal expression. It was like listening to a perfectly calibrated instrument being played by someone else. We would capture perfect takes on the first attempt, with pitch accuracy and tonal quality that normally requires multiple sessions to achieve. But there was something mechanical about the perfection. It lacked the subtle imperfections that make human performances emotionally authentic. The performances were commercially successful, but people who had known Britney before 2007 noticed that something essential had been lost. Chapter 13: The Lost Years. Between 2008 and 2020, Britney continued performing and recording under the conservatorship system, but friends and family members described this period as the lost years, a time when Britney's original personality and consciousness seemed to be suppressed almost completely. Former backup dancer Lisa Rodriguez worked with Britney during several tours in this period and described interactions that suggested Britney was operating in a state of reduced consciousness. Britney would perform flawlessly, interact professionally with the team, and fulfill all her obligations, but there was no spontaneity or genuine personality. She seemed to be following a script that covered every aspect of her behavior. Between performances, she would sit perfectly still for long periods, sometimes for hours, like she was in some kind of standby mode. When you tried to engage her in normal conversation, she would respond appropriately but without any real emotional engagement. Rodriguez also reported that Britney seemed to have limited memory of her experiences during this period. She would perform the same show night after night but seemed surprised by elements of the performance, as if she was experiencing them for the first time. She couldn't remember conversations from previous days or recall details about recent events. It was like she was present physically but not fully conscious or aware of what was happening to her. Family members who maintained contact during this period have described similar observations in private interviews. Chapter 14: The Awakening. The beginning of the end of Britney's conservatorship can be traced to 2019, when she began showing signs that her original consciousness was reasserting itself despite the spiritual control systems that had been suppressing her. The catalyst appears to have been her decision to enter a mental health facility voluntarily, a decision that broke the pattern of externally imposed treatment that had characterized her experience since 2007. Dr. Michael Torres, who worked at the facility where Britney sought treatment in 2019, described a patient who was beginning to reclaim her spiritual autonomy. Britney arrived with clear intentions about what kind of help she wanted to receive. She specifically requested access to meditation practices, energy healing, and spiritual counseling, approaches that had been restricted during her conservatorship. Over the course of several weeks, we observed dramatic improvements in her clarity, emotional authenticity, and sense of personal agency. It was like watching someone wake up from a long, suppressed state. Dr. Torres also noted that Britney demonstrated knowledge about her own condition that suggested she had maintained some level of awareness even during the most controlled periods. She described her experiences since 2007 with remarkable insight and specificity. She understood that she had been subjected to spiritual manipulation and was able to articulate specific techniques that had been used to suppress her consciousness. Most importantly, she had developed her own methods for maintaining spiritual protection and reclaiming her personal energy. The work we did together was more about supporting her own healing process than imposing external treatment. But Britney's spiritual awakening triggered responses from the entities and systems that had been controlling her. Chapter 15: The Final Battle. As Britney began reclaiming her spiritual autonomy in 2020 to 2021, the supernatural forces that had controlled her for over a decade made increasingly desperate attempts to maintain their influence. The #FreeBritney movement, which gained momentum during this period, was more significant than most people realized. According to Dr. Vasquez, mass public attention focused on liberation can actually weaken supernatural control systems. When millions of people focus their intention on freeing someone from spiritual bondage, it creates a powerful energetic force that entities cannot easily counter. The #FreeBritney movement represented a form of mass spiritual intervention. Britney's own social media posts during this period show evidence of someone gradually reclaiming control of their own voice and consciousness. References to spiritual practices and energy work that had been absent from her public communications for over a decade. Increasing use of symbolism and imagery associated with spiritual protection and awakening. Direct challenges to the conservatorship system that showed strategic thinking and personal agency. The legal battle to end the conservatorship was supported by spiritual practices that Britney had apparently been developing in private for years. Attorney Jennifer Chang, who worked on the final conservatorship termination, described unusual aspects of the legal process. Britney demonstrated knowledge about spiritual and legal concepts that she shouldn't have had access to during her conservatorship. She understood the spiritual dimensions of her legal situation and was able to articulate specific steps needed to break the binding contracts. Most remarkably, she had developed personal spiritual practices that seemed designed specifically to counteract the forms of supernatural influence she had been subjected to. She knew exactly what she needed to do to reclaim her spiritual autonomy. On November 12, 2021, Britney's conservatorship was officially terminated. But according to people close to her, the real victory had occurred months earlier when she succeeded in breaking the spiritual bonds that had controlled her consciousness. Chapter 16: The Freedom. Since gaining her freedom from the conservatorship, Britney has shown signs of complete spiritual recovery and has reclaimed the authentic personality that was suppressed for over a decade. Her social media presence, memoir, and public statements demonstrate someone who has not only survived supernatural manipulation but has gained wisdom and strength from the experience. Dr. Vasquez, who has continued monitoring Britney's case, believes that her recovery represents hope for other celebrities who may be trapped in similar situations. Britney's case proves that supernatural control systems can be broken, even when they've been in place for many years. Her recovery demonstrates that consciousness and personal agency can be reclaimed through spiritual practice, legal action, and public support. Most importantly, her willingness to speak publicly about her experiences may help other people recognize when they're being subjected to similar forms of spiritual manipulation. But Britney's freedom also represents a threat to the supernatural entities that operate within the entertainment industry, and her ongoing protection requires continued vigilance. The hair salon incident of February 16, 2007, which seemed like a breakdown at the time, can now be understood as the first successful step in a spiritual liberation process that took 14 years to complete. Britney Spears didn't have a breakdown in 2007. She began a breakout that ultimately led to freedom from forces that most people don't even know exist. Her story serves as both a warning about the supernatural dangers that lurk within celebrity culture and proof that these dangers can be overcome with courage, persistence, and spiritual wisdom. The real Britney Spears, the woman who had been suppressed and controlled for over a decade, is finally free to live her own life and tell her own story. And that story is just beginning.